Hello, we are Gabriella, Ingrid, and Jessica. We are elementary education majors and chose our research topic based on our class ED 228, which is children's literature. Our research project is titled Cinderella Through the Centuries. The question we decided to research was, how has the original literature of Cinderella been transformed through its various theatrical adaptations? We chose the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella as our original literature. We picked the Disney cartoon Cinderella, Another Cinderella, and Ella Enchanted as the theatrical adaptations to compare to the literature. Throughout this presentation, we will discuss the similarities and differences between each movie and the original literature. Our slides contain only a few similarities and differences, so please take a look at our research paper to read the comparisons in more detail.
And for our research methods and limitations, we use qualitative research to find and analyze data. The research included thematic analysis and the constant comparative method for comparing the three movies to the literature from Brothers Grimm. We chose Walt Disney's Cinderella from 1950 because we wanted to include what is known as one of the oldest theatrical adaptations of Cinderella. Another Cinderella Story from 2008 was our second choice for its more contemporary retelling of the story. Finally, Ella Enchanted from 2004 was chosen because it has an interesting magical twist to the familiar fairy tale. We collected primary data ourselves, and the data was gathered by examining the three movies we selected and reading the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. We analyzed and compared these different adaptations to the Brothers Grimm version and drew a conclusion based on our findings by examining the overall plot and character development of Cinderella. One limitation of this study was the small sample size of three movies. There is a wide variety of theatrical adaptations that we could have chosen, but due to our limited access to movies, we only chose three. Another limitation would be personal interpretations in terms of the plot of each movie and the literature. Some people may interpret the plot differently from one another. People may also see differences in the plots that we personally did not notice. Now we'll look at Cinderella from 1950. Walt Disney's 1950 version of Cinderella is one of the earliest film adaptations of the beloved fairy tale, and there are multiple changes to the storyline that alter the story of Cinderella into a more family-friendly version. Cinderella's father passes away in the beginning of the movie, but he is described as a good and kind and devoted father. In the Brothers Grimm version, Cinderella's father never passed away, and he describes his daughter to the prince as a deformed little Cinderella. In the Brothers Grimm retelling of the story, Cinderella's mother's last words were for Cinderella to remain pious and good, but Cinderella decided on her own to be good and kind-hearted in Disney's version. Rather than a 3-day festival like the Brothers Grimm story describes, Cinderella only attends one ball in Disney's version, and it is held with a king in hopes that the prince will find a girl and marry her. Cinderella loses a shoe in both retellings, though in the 1950 version, she loses a glass slipper by accident, and in the Brothers Grimm version, she loses a solid gold slipper that stuck to the pitch that the prince had laid out to stop her from leaving the festival. Cinderella has a fairy godmother who prepares her for the ball in the Disney 1950 version. However, in the Brothers Grimm story, there is no magic or fairy godmother. Cinderella weeps beneath a tree and she planted at her mother's grave, and a bird gives her a beautiful dress, similar to how the birds helped Cinderella pick up the lentils in the fireplace and gave her a dress. Cinderella's only friends and helpers in the 1950 version are animals: mice, Bruno the dog, and a horse. Disney's adaptation seemed to be made for children because there was an emphasis on animals, and Disney removed most, if not all, of the dark descriptions of what the stepsisters went through to win over the prince. Near the end of the story, Grimm's version describes how the evil stepmother convinced her daughters to cut off their toe or heel to fit into the dainty glass slipper. But in the 1950 version, the stepsisters simply try to force their feet in the shoe. In the Disney version, we don't know what happened to Cinderella's stepmother or stepsisters after Cinderella marries the prince. The Brothers Grimm version of the tale ends by stating the stepsisters try to get in the good graces of Cinderella at the church where she was to be wed, but birds came and pecked their eyes out. The stepsisters, for their wickedness and falsehood, were punished with blindness as long as they lived. Thankfully, Disney's 1950 version adaptation is much more uplifting. In both adaptations of the Cinderella story, Cinderella and the prince lived happily ever after.
Another Cinderella Story is a modern theatrical adaptation of the Cinderella fairy tale that is geared towards young adults. This version of Cinderella has many differences and a few similarities in comparison to the literature of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. In this adaptation of Cinderella, the main character is named Mary. Unlike Cinderella from Brothers Grimm, she never had a father in her life. Mary's mother was a background dancer for a singer named Dominique. When Mary's mother died, Dominique acquired legal guardianship of Mary. Dominique and her two biological children, Britt and Bree, were often referred to as Mary's stepmother and stepsisters. However, they are technically the adopted mother and sisters of Mary. Mary was forced to do the cleaning and cooking and other household duties just as Cinderella had in the Brothers Grimm story. However, the difference in Another Cinderella Story was that Mary lives in the guest house with her own space and belongings. Mary attends school and lives a relatively normal life despite essentially being a live-in maid for Dominique. Both Another Cinderella Story and Cinderella from Brothers Grimm have a ball where the Cinderella character dances with the prince-like character. There are four major differences about this part of the story. The first is that rather than a prince throwing the ball, it is a school dance in Another Cinderella Story. Secondly, Mary dances with a pop star, Joey Parker, who attends school with her rather than a prince. The next difference was whereas Cinderella loses her slipper, Mary loses her MP3 player at the ball. Lastly, rather than animals helping Mary complete her task in order for her to go to the ball, her friend hired cleaners to clean for Mary. The prince in Cinderella and the pop star in Another Cinderella Story both figure out the identity of their mystery woman from the ball. The prince and Cinderella are married immediately after the discovery, and the story ends shortly after the marriage. In Another Cinderella Story, the discovery of Mary being his mystery dance partner is only about halfway through the plot of the story. Mary and Joey begin to date, break up, and get back together. It was never stated whether the couple were ever married and or stayed together after graduating high school and leaving to further their education. Mary's happy ending was being accepted into her dream dance school opposed to being married to her partner. Another Cinderella Story holds the same message as the Brothers Grimm literature. The message is that life will eventually reward those who deserve it. Mary was always kind to others despite her less than desirable home life and held on to her dreams of a better life. In the end, Mary's dreams came true and she was able to leave her old life behind, just as Cinderella had in the Brothers Grimm fairy tale.
Ella Enchanted is the final theatrical adaptation that we studied. Ella Enchanted is an entertaining and creative adaptation of the Cinderella fairy tale that has become popular in society today. When comparing this adaptation to the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, we have found that there are many differences between the two stories, as well as some similarities. For example, Ella's father in this theatrical adaptation is represented as kind. He is absent for most of the film, however, it is clear that he cares about Ella. In contrast to this, however, in the Brothers Grimm version, the father is not nearly as kind and compassionate towards Cinderella. Instead, he calls her only a deformed little Cinderella from my first wife, but she cannot possibly be the bride. This is not something a loving father would say about his daughter. Thus, the father character portrayed in each is very different. Another difference is that in the Grimm fairy tale, there is no fairy godmother. Instead, there is a magic tree near her mother's grave with birds that assist Cinderella magically to her happily ever after. In the film Ella Enchanted, Ella embarks on a journey on her own to get rid of a spell put on her by her fairy godmother. That shows her independence in taking control of her situation. In the Brothers Grimm version of this story, Cinderella stays in her situation and is portrayed as more of a victim than a heroine. Both of these stories include a prince. In the Grimm story, Cinderella is rescued from her tragic life. However, in Ella Enchanted, there is also a prince who rescues her from various situations. In the end, though, Ella is the one to do the rescuing. As mentioned above, there are birds that assist Cinderella in the Brothers Grimm version of this story. But in Ella Enchanted, animals do not play a large role in assisting her. She is instead accompanied on her journey by an elf and an enchanted book. Brothers Grimm is also far more gory than the theatrical adaptation, which does not portray the bloody parts of the earlier versions of this story. There are also similarities between these two versions. For example, in both versions of the Cinderella story, Cinderella, or Ella, is portrayed as kind-hearted and beautiful. They are also both taken advantage of by their families. However, they both end up with the prince and in love. In conclusion, both the Cinderella versions told by Brothers Grimm and the theatrical adaptation of Ella Enchanted, are similar when considering the core of the story. However, there are also differences in the presentation and details of each, which are interesting to look at. There are many more comparisons that can be made and differences to be examined, but all in all, this story is of a girl who goes from a life of suffering to success and happiness, and has been inspiring generations through the centuries. Cinderella is a well-known character, and there are many different portrayals of her in books, movies, plays, and musicals. Her story has been told for centuries to generation after generation. This leads one to believe that there is a timeless and valued message that this story tells its audience. The details and storyline are different, but the ending is the same. A girl in suffering has risen from the ashes to overcome hardship and attain success and happiness. Why this research matters? It is important to understand how this prominent character is being portrayed to children. And modern society has evolved the character of Cinderella from a victim mentality to more of an independent heroine.
And here's our link to the research paper, and here's our works cited. Thank you.